Hey everybody, this is Steve Winward, and in this video, I want to cover the different security features you have available to you to secure your Power BI deployment for your organization. The product group recently put together a Power BI security white paper, which goes into way more detail than this video will. But this video, what I want to do is I want to go over three main areas in terms of what are the different options you have available from a security perspective. And so here they are. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is front-end user-facing traffic and the different ways you can kind of control how people get to the Power BI portal. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the backend connectivity story for the Power BI service and different scenarios of how you can connect to data, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on-premise, whether it's in an isolated network like a VNET. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at when data is in the Power BI service, how do you control that? And so what are the different control mechanisms for reports inside of Power BI? All right, so now we're going to jump into the user-facing traffic here. So what I have here is this is a diagram of the out-of-the-box configuration for the Power BI service. And there's a couple of things that are going on here. One is you'll notice that the Power BI service actually lives in Azure. Now, in most cases, you're going to be licensing Power BI through Office 365. But Power BI, the service, actually lives in the Azure data center region that's configured for your Office 365 tenant. And it's really important to understand that because when you actually get to the point that you're controlling network flow to your organization's Power BI service, it's really important to understand that. So here we've got end users at the bottom in your customer environment, in your organization's environment, and they're going to access this with app.powerbi.com. Now, anybody in commercial Office 365 are going to be accessing the Power BI service with app.powerbi.com. Under the covers, that's going to route to an Azure IP, which then takes you to the Power BI service. If you're in Azure for Government or using one of our government clouds, you'll be hitting a slightly different endpoint, but that would be something like star.powerbigov.us. Now, the other thing to kind of keep in mind here is that by default, the Power BI service, because it is a SaaS offering in the cloud, is a publicly addressable IP. That means that no matter where people are coming in the world from an IP range, they can still hit the Power BI service. So the question is how do you control that if you wanted to for your organization? And the other thing I wanted to point right here is that this is actually just showing you an NS lookup of commercial Power BI, so app.powerbi.com, resolving back to an IP address. If you were to look at the commercial Azure IP ranges, you would see that this range, the 20.186. whatever, that falls into an Azure commercial IP range for a data center. Now, the first thing you can do from controlling how people get to the Power BI portal is leveraging something called Azure Private Links. Azure Private Links is not a Power BI specific thing. It's actually something you can use inside of Azure with other resources inside of Azure. And the way you configure this is that you create a VNET inside of Azure. And then inside of that VNET, you configure a private endpoint that then can get to the Power BI portal. Once you set this up in Power BI, the service, you have the option to disable internet-facing traffic. Once you turn that on, so once you disable internet-facing traffic, users have to go to a very specific path to get to the Power BI service. Specifically, they need access to the VNET, and they're going to be able to need access to that private endpoint to get to the Power BI service. And so the way that you control that is that if you have ExpressRoute configured for your organization, you can use Microsoft peering to get that into the VNET. The other thing you can do is you can use VPNs to enable people that maybe aren't coming from your on-premise network infrastructure, but still be able to get to the Power BI service. So in this example here, we've got your customer environment at the bottom, which is leveraging ExpressRoute, so they are able to get to the Power BI service. However, when people are at their favorite coffee shop just over public Wi-Fi and not using a VPN, they're blocked to get to the Power BI service. And then if we were to enable people at your favorite coffee shop to have the VPN, once they connect to the VPN, they have access to the Power BI service. The moment they drop the VPN connection, they no longer have access to the Power BI service. It's instantaneous in terms of eliminating people from getting to your Power BI service. The other thing I want to mention here is that when you set this up, you do need to set up some DNS configuration for your environment as well. Because now what you're going to be doing is you're not using the public IP to get to the Power BI service. You're now using a private IP. So you just have a little bit of DNS configuration to get this all up and running. Now, the other option that you have available is something called Azure Active Directory Conditional Access. And this behaves differently than Azure Private Links. So conditional access, the way that it works is that it works on sign-ins. So when users go to sign into cloud applications, you have a number of attributes that you can make decisions on to determine, can this user proceed to the application or should you deny the request? You can look at things like location. So which IP address are they coming from? Is this a trusted IP that we trust for our organization and we should let them get to the Power BI service or not? You can also target this by user or group. So you can say that this particular policy only applies to a select people of a certain group in Azure Active Directory. So you could say, maybe certain people from our favorite coffee shop should be able to get to the Power BI service, but for everybody else in the organization, we'll go ahead and block that. You can also target devices like iOS or Android and platform as well, which is pretty cool. And just to kind of summarize here, when you're comparing doing either private links or conditional access, a couple of things I want to highlight here. First, private links is an all or nothing setting at the tenant level. So if you have 50,000 people in your organization and you enable private links and you disable internet-facing traffic, every single person in your organization is going to have to be able to use the VPN, or they're going to be able to have to get to that through ExpressRoute with peering configured. You don't have any flexibility in terms of select users or groups inside of that maybe don't have to use the VPN to get to the Power BI service. With Azure Active Directory and Conditional Access, you have much more fine-grained control over select users, groups, IP ranges, and you have a lot more flexibility with who you're applying these policies to. The other thing with Azure Private Links is that there is some infrastructure you do have to set up in Azure. So for your organization, you do need somebody that is knowledgeable in terms of kind of IaaS things in Azure to be able to get kind of the networking and all that set up. Once you do that, you're good to go, but that is kind of an upfront thing. AAD Conditional Access, there is an additional license you need from Azure Active Directory, but once you enable that, it's really easy to set up these policies and you don't have to create any of the infrastructure yourself to do this. All right, so the next section I'm going to cover here is data connections. So how does the Power BI service consume different backend data sources? And so what I'm looking at here is the Power BI service consuming different resources in Azure. And for this example here, I'm assuming that these resources are not isolated in a VNET in Azure. And so when you create, for example, a resource like Azure SQL Server, you have different firewall policies that you could apply to that. There's one policy, and if you check this box, it'll say, allow all Microsoft Cloud services to have access to my SQL Server instance. If you did that, the Power BI service would be part of that and would be allowed to then go to SQL Server to get data back to a report for Power BI. If you want to be a little bit more controlling around what IP ranges you want inside of Azure to have access to your resource, you can now use the Power BI service tags that are available in Azure. And so what's really cool about that is that if you enable the service tag, which is just Power BI, it will automatically update whatever the IP ranges are as they get updated by the Power BI product group. And that's something that was also recently added for the Power BI service. This is taking a look at an example of what those service tags look like. So if you just do a Bing search for Azure IP ranges, you'll probably get this search to download. It's a JSON file that has all of the service tags available in public Azure. I'm also showing an example for Azure for Government. And you'll notice that the IP ranges are different. And once again, that's because with our different sovereign clouds, those IP ranges are totally different IP ranges from our commercial instance of Azure. Now let's take another scenario here. So in this case, what we have is we still have Azure resources we want to consume with Power BI, but this time they're isolated in a VNET, which means that these resources, instead of having publicly addressable IP addresses, they're now using private IPs, and you can only get to these private IPs if you're inside of the VNET. And the design pattern that we have today is you have to install something called the data gateway. There's no license to use that. As long as you have Power BI, you're able to leverage this. This also works with other things in the Power Platform like Power Apps and Power Automate as well. So what you do is you install this on a VM in your VNet. You also configure the network connectivity so that you need outbound HTTPS traffic, and under the covers, the data gateway is using something called the Azure Service Bus Relay. And so you do have to enable that IP range for outbound HTTPS traffic. Once you do that, the data gateway then can securely talk to the Power BI service. It can also talk to any of the resources inside of your VNet, and then you're able to expose that data into the Power BI service. And now the other scenario is, let's say you have data on-prem and you want to get that inside of the Power BI service. It's the exact same paradigm as what you would do with something in a VNet today. You install the data gateway on-premise on a VM that has access to whatever the data source is that you want on-premise. And once you do that, once again, Power BI the service can securely talk to your data gateway to be able to get the data back into the Power BI service. The other thing I want to mention is that the Power Platform product group is actually rolling out VNet connectivity support. So what this means is that in the future, you will not need the data gateway if you have resources inside of a VNet. And so what that looks like from an architecture perspective is the exact same kind of setup, except in this case, you'll see that Power BI is going directly to the resources in your VNet. Under the covers, what that means is that Power BI is doing something called VNet injection. So you have to allow this to happen inside of your Azure subscription. But once you configure this, Power BI, the service, can get to those resources as if they weren't in a VNet, and it does it all securely by default. But it's just really nice because it's one less piece of infrastructure that you have to install to get access to resources inside of a VNet in your Power BI service. And then the last area I wanted to cover is report security. So we've kind of covered, connectivity from the front end and the back end. But once you have data in the portal, how do you secure that? And the first thing I wanted to talk about here are workspace roles. So a workspace is just a logical container for data sets, reports, and dashboards, and you can permission those however you'd like to. Think of it as just a folder where your reports are going to live. There's 4 different roles in a workspace today: viewer, contributor, member, and admin. And each of those have progressively more and more permissions. I'm not going to talk about all the permissions here, but you can look at our documentation. This kind of lays out all the different permissions that you have available to you based on the role. But that is just the out-of-the-box experience you get with workspace roles. The next thing I wanted to cover is something that's a little bit more of an advanced scenario and something that was also recently added to the Power BI service. Power BI, the service, also supports Azure Information Protection Sensitivity Labels. And really what that boils down to is that when you create reports and dashboards, you can tag those with sensitivity labels. You could, for example, say that this report is confidential. And what happens under the covers is that if any user were to export data from that report, Power BI is then going to apply that sensitivity label to the data as it's leaving the service. And what's cool about that is that what it's doing is actually encrypting the data, and then that sensitivity label carries with that file wherever it goes. So if somebody not in your organization that shouldn't be able to view this content gets access to the file, they won't be able to actually view the data because they won't be able to authenticate to unencrypt the file. And so that's a really awesome feature that's now available in the Power BI service, available both in commercial as well as our US government sovereign clouds. The other really awesome security feature that we have in Power BI the service now is something called MCAS, Microsoft Cloud App Security. And this is a really awesome product because what it does is it actually acts as a proxy in front of the Power BI service. And then you can do some really cool real-time security decisions. There's built-in anomaly detection. So if you have a user in your organization that all of a sudden is downloading hundreds of files out of the Power BI service in a really short time frame, you can actually stop them from doing that real time with MCAS. MCAS also makes it really easy to do investigations too. So you can, after the fact, really easily surface all of the audit log information that the Power BI service is pumping into our audit logs. And so this is just another security tool that you can use to take your security a step further with the Power BI service. And so with that, first off, I just wanted to thank you all for watching my video. If you have any comments or questions on this, please feel free to put them in the comments below. And until next time, thank you again for watching my video.